911 dispatchers of Reddit. What's the most interesting reason someone called 911? We had a guy with a mental disorder keep calling every few days asking us if he had run over someone. He couldn't relax until we said no, you didn't run over anyone. Everything is okay. Sometimes he would come by and have you check under his car. Poor fella. Oh wow, that's sad. I can't imagine having to live with that on a day-to-day basis. I hope he takes his meds and has good support. My friend works dispatch and I asked her this a few months ago. She said that there's a couple that complains at least once a month that someone is shooting pornography through their window via some sort of projector, and whenever the cops come it's not there anymore. No one knows if it's actually happening or not, haha. It's really difficult to answer questions like this because you get so many calls. They all just blur together. And TBH, a lot of them are really weird. Like, a lot. After a while you get so many calls that are screaming word salad from schizophrenics, or angry rambling drunks, or paranoid dementia patients, or crazy violence, or weird injuries and medical conditions, etc. that your definition of what makes an interesting call changes a lot from what most people would find interesting. But to actually answer your question, I guess the lady who wanted to report her boyfriend for domestic violence because he made the chili too spicy on purpose, and he knows I have the shoots. One of my more memorable was the lady who called while coming to the station and she wanted to report a domestic disturbance. Had her continue to the station, but what she failed to mention was that the domestic was between her 24-year-old son and the dog. Apparently the son yelled at and pushed the dog out of his room because it was interfering with the fact he was in the middle of having sex with his girlfriend. Mom wanted us to interview the dog before arresting her son after getting the dog's statement. Just for the record, the son was not arrested and the dog was not interviewed. I'm not a dispatcher. My dad has dementia and keeps calling 911. I feel sorry for the dispatchers. He never remembers why he called, although this last time he told my mom they don't seem to mind. In the past 2 weeks I've seen 2 funny calls come out from dispatch. The first was a dangerous animal call. A white poodle named Charlie was humping children and it was disturbing. The second was a woman calling and saying the FBI was in her trash. There was a third, but it disappeared from pending. It said a woman was having issues with Michael Jordan, Idris Elba and another person, but I couldn't remember the name. I have a friend who working on his way to becoming an officer. One day he was at the station when he comes across a police report of responding to a 911 call from a 6-year-old boy. Reason: he didn't want to share his candy. I called the police 2 times in one night because I saw a kid getting bullied in my apartment complex and was concerned, but I got nervous, hung up, and tried again but got nervous again. My dad was PLOL. No one knew why I did it until recently. Dispatcher here. We get way too many calls a day to recall everyone. Even the interesting ones all tend to blend together. The 2 that stick out in my mind this week were the couple who called us because they were being followed by a pit bull in a sweater and that it could be aggressive. He ended up being very sweet and very lost. The other was an elderly gentleman who became very angry because his neighbor was parking in front of his house, legally, on a public street. He became incensed with me when I told him it wasn't against the law. He was less happy when the 2 officers showed up with a summons for misuse of 911. He got a second one for disorderly conduct by the end of their visit. We tend to get a lot of calls from people with mental health issues, but the one that sticks in my mind was a gentleman who would call daily to update us on President Obama's transition to a lizard person, while Michelle Obama was the real Barack. He was a daily caller and always kept in touch until he tried to burn down an apartment building and was sent to a facility with no phone access. Cop here. Lady called 911 because she and her husband were moving a sofa into their house through the front door and it got stuck. Wouldn't go back out or any further in. Due to the risk of getting sued if we damage the sofa or the door in the process of trying to help them, we let them know that we couldn't help. An officer did get on the radio and asked if they had tried pivoting the sofa. Pivot. Not a 911 dispatcher, but a former reporter who read 911 call logs. A man called an ambulance because he hadn't pooped in 3 days. I mean, that's kinda concerning, TBH. As a 5-year-old I called to tell them my caterpillar had died. They did come. My parents apologized, but the cops insisted they would look at my caterpillar. Upon further inspection they told me it was just a chrysalis and it would be a butterfly soon. It was the most beautiful butterfly. This one made me smile, haha. I called the police accidentally thinking it was my dad's work number. I was 5 and wanted to snitch on my brother. It was his birthday and he got a tennis racket and he jokingly was chasing my mum around the house, hitting her with it, being annoying. This was the first phone call I ever made and it went a bit like this from what I can remember. Operator 999, what's your emergency? Or something like that. Me. Daddy, come home quick, John's hitting mum with a tennis racket. Operator, can you confirm your address? Me. No lady, just put my dad on or tell him to come home. Then hung up. Went had a nice lunch out that day and came home to 4 police officers at the house asking about domestic violence reported by a young girl. Mum gives mortified look in my direction. Not a dispatcher, but my dad runs 911. Had a guy call once because he was shaking his leg and his foot fell off. Straight crap. He was diabetic. That's actually terrifying. My brother, who is autistic, called the cops since my mom wouldn't buy him ketchup to make up for it, and as a punishment, my mom gave them the leftover cupcakes we had. I worked in emergency communications for a short time. I loved the job, but my training didn't work out, so it wasn't loving me. There are a few calls that stick with me. I remember we had a sex worker call one evening because she had provided services and the other person didn't pay her. We had a person call one evening because someone stole her illegal substances from her vehicle. The agency that I work for gets a lot of butt dials. Several times a night we would answer the line and hear the thump thump music from the club. At some point later in the evening we would occasionally get a call back from the person, and when you let them know it was emergency communications they would have a brief moment of panic, but we would just check and make sure that they were okay and that it was a misdeal and remind them to be mindful with their phone. It would also happen many times with kids playing with their parents' phone or a phone without service, because although a cell phone doesn't have service you can still use it to call emergency services. We would listen to the line for a moment to make sure there was nothing going on in the background like screaming, etc. If we could get the child to give the phone to an adult we would make sure everyone was fine and let them know to be careful letting the child play with the phone. I'm still with the same agency but in a different department. I'm hoping to possibly get back to emergency communications again. Knowing more about the backside of things than I did when I first began, I think that I could do much better if I were given the opportunity. We'll see how it goes. I called 911 once because I was scared of a noise outside my house and didn't want to investigate alone. I just wanted someone on the phone while I went and couldn't call anyone at 3 AM. That's pretty legit. I almost called 911 once because someone was breathing heavily right behind me, and I was on a couch next to a big picture window, so next to me was outside looking in. I slid off the couch and was about to go to the phone before I had a cell when I realized it was my cat snoring from behind the couch. I almost had a heart attack, all because of a lazy kitty. For the sake of contributing interesting stories relevant to the post, I'll share what my dispatcher buddy told me about the poop in the pocket guy. This man would frequently call in and was masturbating to the voice of the dispatcher. He would ask what they were wearing and such. Sometimes he would come into the station and it was found out he kept soiled toilet paper in his pocket to sniff at his leisure. Some people become around at very weird things. The bondage guy. They got a call from a concerned person who saw someone in the park that looked dangerous. They show up and find a guy in full gimp gear, complete with bull gag. Not sure what he was doing walking around the park, but it turns out he was an off-duty cop from the precinct over. And for the saddest, the city has a lot of iron gates with sharp points on top. They would be called frequently in the fall to respond to deer who had impaled themselves on the fence. It was considered too risky to shoot them in the middle of a city, so they would just have to let them die on the fence. Woman called to say she'd been on Facetime with a man that showed her the bodies of 2 people he killed. She was calling from another state and wasn't sure where exactly he was. Spent a lot of time getting as much information from her as possible. Convinced myself that this is nuts and there's no way that he actually showed her dead bodies. Came into work the next day and the bodies had been discovered and an arrest made. A few of my favorites. The gentleman who called wanting to show us the pot plant. It was poison ivy. He had found behind the fishing hole, who when we asked him his name he told us he was the one-eyed bandit. His blood type was beer and his rambling days were done. Same guy called a few months later after he drunkenly tried to attack his mother-in-law and she whooped his butt with an umbrella. LOL. Animal calls are always fun too. We've had a lady call in telling us there was a group of deer on the side of the road and that she thought they were up to no good and we needed to remove them. Or the pack of dogs that didn't read the road closed sign and went down the road anyways even though it's closed. Or the lady who freaked out when she called about rats in her apartment and rhetorically asked out loud how could they have gotten in. I stupidly responded with, well, they probably came in through the walls. She did not. The list goes on and on. Most of the really good ones are NSW, so I'm not sure if I can tell them here, but the amount of stupid out there really is terrifying. I do admin work for a police department and occasionally get calls for service. One time a guy called because he was being chased by a goose, another because the goose wouldn't cross the road, and another because a bat flew over their head. My job can be so far from boring some days. LOL. Some of my favorites. From working dispatch/911 in Arizona many years ago, the lady who called to report that a flaming cat had fallen from the sky and pancaked in front of her. It was the cause of the utility pole fire nearby. Kitty had tried to jump on top of a high voltage transformer. Tourists trying to follow a gas station road map and take a shortcut at night, not knowing that the dotted line meant it wasn't really a road, but pretty much a jeep trail. Had that happened twice. A light aircraft crash inside restricted prison airspace in the middle of a thunderstorm. Got a lot of overtime pay for that one. We also had an elderly lady who was pretty lonely and would call every night at the same time. If we didn't talk to her for a bit, she would call again later and claim someone was outside her house so she could talk to an officer. So, we chatted with her. She listened for the sound of radio traffic or the other line ringing, and politely stand by while we took care of calls. It got to the point she was pretty much friends with all the dispatchers. We would look forward to talking to her most times. Her daughter finally put her in a rest home once it became clear that she wasn't taking good care of herself, and we figured that was that. A couple weeks later, I got a call from her, whispering into the phone, "You've got to help me. I've been kidnapped." After a while, she made friends at the home, and the calls tapered off. I like to think she was happy and not so lonely anymore. There were some pretty horrendous things, too, but I prefer not to dwell on those. So many stories it's hard to pick just one. It was certainly the most interesting job I ever had. Light aircraft crash in restricted prison airspace. I work in my prison yard, and that is definitely one of my freaking nightmares. The most interesting reason I've ever called 911 was that I got an actual message in a bottle on the beach. The message said that the writer was being held on a shrimp boat and the captain was out to kill him. Gave the name of the vessel and the crew member, so I called it in. The policewoman thought I was pulling her leg when she showed up, but then later had a look of what the frick am I going to do with this crap? I need to know how this ended. Not a dispatcher, but a caller. Had to call the cops at my place of work. BC, a Nazi, tatted up with swastikas and everything, got into a fight with a guest over cigarettes and was swinging around a pool cleaning net. That was a weird day. Where to start? Maybe the woman that called 911 because she lived in a gated community and the rent-a-cop in the guard shack at the front gates wasn't answering his phone. Maybe the guy who was on some real crap, so he went to a hospital and threw an iguana at someone. Maybe the one where a man called from outside a Target store, claiming some guys had killed his brother, and then he got beat to death while on the phone with me. Maybe it's the woman that called in because her 4-month-old Babigeneral Hawthorne had stopped breathing. Maybe it was the 16-year-old girl who called in because she was wasted and mentally unwell, and slit her wrists but didn't want to die alone on a regional park trail. Or the guy who felt like he was a failure of a father, so he was sitting in a car on the edge of a cliff doing coke with a 9mm on the dash. Could just be the guy who doesn't like mariachi music though. Got a lot of those. I once had a patient call 911 from his IQ bed because he wanted to be taken back down to the O where the beds are more comfortable. I was a dispatcher for a few years, One of the more memorable calls was an older woman who said her granddaughter borrowed her car and parked it somewhere, but they couldn't find it. Police looked out for the car for 3 days and she called several times a day to get updates. She was pretty convincing and blamed her granddaughter for being irresponsible and into drugs. I called the number back to let her know we weren't able to find her car and a nurse answered. It was a nursing home and the woman didn't own a car. Another was a guy who had purchased drugs from someone he suspected drugged his drugs and wanted to report it. Happens more often than you would think that people call to report something about the drugs they purchased or the prostitute they hired. Had an old lady who had a UT and in old people, a UT can cause hallucinations. She called 911 stating men were breaking into her home. When the officer arrived they found her laying in the middle of the road in nothing but her nightie during a rainstorm. When they got her inside she said that she left her home and went to an island in the middle of the ocean to get away from them and that's where she was when the officer found her. My first day on the job. I'm shadowing someone just to fill the time until the end of the day and this woman calls, saying her son just punched her. Eventually the son pulls the phone from his mom and goes on about how he can't have the cops come, because he can't go to jail cause he can't make friends there. Well okay buddy. There is a boy sitting on his front porch applying what appears to be peanut butter to his penis and his dog is licking it. True story. And yes we sent officers. And yes. The boy was having his penis licked by his dog. I think the reason why no dispatcher is responding is that someone with an interesting reason for calling 911 is talking to them now. True, but hey at least I got 8 upvotes out of this. Not a dispatcher, but I did call 911 3 different times to unlock my car for me. When I got my first car, I was terrible at keeping track of my keys and often locked them in my vehicle. After the 3rd time of calling the police to come and Slim Jim my car open, the officer looked at me sternly and said, "You know you're not supposed to call 911 about this kind of stuff, right?" I felt immediate shame as I realized it was kind of an butthole thing to do. I worked commercial EMS a long time. Moved from working on the ambulance into dispatching the ambulances after a few years. Then moved on to air ambulance dispatch. You wouldn't believe the dumb crap people call ambulances for. And sometimes it's not just the public doing it. Sometimes 911 dispatchers punt it to us because they don't know who else to give it to. Any form is tiny complaint people call for. People will go weeks and weeks with something going on and then finally call an ambulance at 0337 in the morning. You ask them what's different now that they finally called and the answer is always nothing. I just can't take it anymore. Chill buddy, I understand your struggles and I see the frustration in your text. I want you to know that a random Reddit spurg from the other side of the world cares about you and appreciates your work. When I was little, my mom told me to call 911 whenever there's an emergency. My mom was in the shower. I had the first 2 Shrek movies on DVD and I was watching them. I didn't know how to work the DVD player. The movie ended, and I called 911 to ask how to eject the movie. They asked for my mom, and I said she wasn't around. An officer showed up to check in. My mom was incredibly embarrassed. Newspaper reporter. Not a 911 dispatcher, but one time I heard this call over the scanner. Dispatch called one of the cops and said a woman called in saying she was doing some home remodeling work and accidentally broke a pipe in her apartment, which caused her apartment to start flooding. The cop actually said, "What does she expect us to do?" A family member once told me this great story. I can't remember most of the details, just the gist. A dude called 911 and was super incoherent. And out of it, I think they were being kicked out of somewhere for being drunk or homeless. "I've been shot." "Sir, where were you shot?" "I was shot in Vietnam." Well, my old neighbors, one of them I think said, "I'm leaving you, I'm into pony play," and the other one whipped them with their leather jacket yelling "NAYYY," and she got arrested for assault charges. The zipper of the jacket made deep cuts on the husband. I think you meant May. Was a supervisor in a 911 call center. The office was located on the 2nd floor. It had large windows on 2 of the walls. One set of windows allowed us to look up the main road about a 1/4 mile and rose slightly as it led to the north. The street was lined with typical street lamps and a good amount of businesses on both sides. At around 8 PM on a summer night I was looking out this particular window and noticed the street lamps go out at the furthest point visible. Slowly both the lamps and businesses went dark, rolling towards my location. The lights flickered in our building went out but immediately came back on, as did the businesses and lamps that stretched away from our location. While power outages are rare in our area, it wasn't an earth-shattering situation, just strange. Not a minute later we received a call from a woman who lived a good 2 miles to the east. 911, what is your emergency? Caller, there's something hovering over my house. 911, would this be a bird or? Caller, no, it is an aircraft of some kind and it's over my house. 911, okay miss, we will send someone out. 911, miss, line is dead. Responding officer reports nothing found but resident insists a large craft was over her, hovering over her house. E911, enhanced, allows us to see the location of the originating phone call without them having to tell us. Spooky. Mine, calling to complain about an Amber Alert at 11 PM. Interfered with their TV program or sleeping. Meanwhile, the little girl was killed. Co-worker who used to work ambulance dispatch. A teenager who got an eggplant stuck in his butt. I read eggplant and elephant and was very confused. Someone called in and said there was a guy going door to door asking if this is where the N live. I live in a very rural place and there are no black families here. I called the police once because someone was beating a dog outside. They told me I was wasting their time. I could hear it howling 4 floors up. That's terribly sad. There is a released audio of some random kid that called for help with his math homework. The dispatcher thought it was pretty funny and did his best to help. My little sister once called the police because her tooth hurt. My parents were out for dinner and 2 officers showed up to the house. 14-year-old me had to deal with it. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.